I'd like to welcome you to Thrive in the Word. Thank you for joining us today in our study of the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. Before we get into the teaching, I want to ask you to do this. Will you hit the like button and hit the subscribe button? It will help us out a whole lot. It'll help us to reach more people. And then at the end of this video, you're going to see a web address. Go ahead and go to that web address. There's all kinds of good quality Bible-based teaching there at that web address. We cover so many different subjects, and it will help you in a tremendous way. Also, if you feel like the Lord's leading you to give to this ministry, hit the give button, follow the directions, and you'll become a partner with us in reaching and teaching the world and how to thrive. Now, today we're in Revelations, the 2nd chapter, verse number 15. The thing that Jesus has against the church at Pergamum is that they were being highly influenced by 2 different doctrines, 2 different sets of teaching. And the first one that we talked about last week is the teaching of Balaam. Now, what was the teaching of Balaam? Well, what had happened is Balak, back in the Old Testament, Balak had come to Balaam, and he said, how can I get Israel to fall? You see, Balaam was not a righteous man. He was not a prophet of God. But Balak went to Balaam and he said, how can I get Israel to fall? And Balaam said this, he said, let your women marry the Israeli men. Bring them in with the Israeli men, and you know what? It will become a stumbling block to them. Well, to bring that into modern day understanding, I believe that the doctrine of Balaam is that Christians can marry non-believers or unbelievers, that believers can marry unbelievers. You know, we talked about this in our last video, so I don't want to take a lot of time with it, but it becomes a stumbling block to the believer when they marry and come into relationship with an unbeliever. Now, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the doctrine or the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Let's go ahead and read verse number 15. It says, so you also have some who in the same way hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Now, it's not a very big verse, but it says a lot. What is it saying? Well, first of all, it says some. It didn't say the whole church there at Pergamum is giving into the teaching of the Nicolaitans. But what we see here is that Jesus is concerned, and he has something against this church. And I believe that Jesus realizes that false teaching in a church spreads like wildfire. And so he talks about the teaching of Balaam. Now he's talking about the teaching of Nicholas or the Nicolaitans. What is the teaching of Nicolaitans? Now you remember back when we studied the book of the church at Ephesus, and the church at Ephesus hated the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Now Ephesus and Pergamum are not that far apart, but they have a different attitude towards this teaching. Now, what is the teaching of the Nicolaitans? First of all, we believe that the teaching of the Nicolaitans came from a man by the name of Nicholas. Now, if you go back into the book of Acts, you'll find out that Nicholas was one of the very first deacons in the New Testament church, in the church at Jerusalem. He was a deacon there. But now we have to ask ourselves, what did Nicholas do? Well, Nicholas began to adopt this idea that a Christian can mix all types of religions and all types of things into their lives, and it's all right. Nicholas believed that it was all right for believers to marry unbelievers. He was actually a follower of the doctrine of Balaam. And so Nicholas would teach that. Now, the problem is in this, that it sounds good. Oh, yeah, I'm a Christian. I can do whatever I want. I can drink all the alcohol I want. I can have all the sex I want. I can do whatever I want. You know, we a term arose about 10 years ago, and people start calling it greasy grace. In other words, it just causes you to slide. You can do whatever you want. Let me tell you something. That's not the grace of God. The Bible teaches us that the grace of God leads us to conquer sin, not to live in sin. Do you understand? And so this teaching of Nicholas, or the Nicolaitans, this teaching is very prevalent in many churches today that says, well, you can just do what you want. You can mix things. You can mix religions. You can mix all types of things. You're under grace. You're all right. Well, Jesus had something to say. He said, I have something against you. There's some of you who are giving in to that teaching. Now, also, when we look at this word Nicholas or Nicolaitans, it's the Greek word Nikolos, and it's a compound word, and the first one is Nico. Now, what is Nico? Well, have you ever heard of the shoe Nike? Well, that word Nike means the conqueror. But as we look at this word Nikolos, you know what? What we see here is the conqueror, and then the last word is logos, or not logos, laos, and it means the laity. What was the teaching of Nicholas, or the Nicolaitans? It was the teaching that if you are the leader, that you then conquer the people, and that the people follow you. And what was happening here is Nicholas was a person who, even though he was confronted with his sin, never repented. Why? Because he was never held in a place of accountability. Brothers and sisters, let me say this to you. I realize our time is running short, but let me say this to you. If you're in a church where the leader's not accountable to the people there, that his life is just out of control, get out of that church and find another church, because it's the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, and Jesus has something against that doctrine. So as we close this session, understand the two things that Jesus has against the church at Pergamum. They've given themselves into two different doctrines: the doctrine of Balaam and the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope this has informed you and helped you. I hope that it causes you to grow in your spiritual life. Join us again tomorrow as we continue our study of this church, the church at Pergamum.